Hey everyone, my name is Taylor Hopkins and I serve as the Director of College Partnerships here at Classic Learning Test CLT. And I am so thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Timothy Bartel from St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. Today we have just the great privilege of hearing from Dr. Bartel, who is the Provost and Professor of Great Texts and Theology at St. Constantine. And his specialty is actually in the poetry of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, Longfellow is not a part of our CLT Author Bank, but we have made an exception as we think that we still have lots to learn from the work of Longfellow, from the lecture of Dr. Bartel, and we think that you're in for a treat. So, Dr. Bartel, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get us started.
All right, thank you so much. So I have thought about this lecture as sort of an introduction to Longfellow in his relationship to the classics and to the author bank in particular, because Longfellow was probably the most lauded and popular and well-known American poet of the 19th century. And a lot of his prowess, I think a lot of his subjects, a lot of the ways that he chose to write poetry and became famous for that poetry were due to his deep love of and deep relationship with the classics throughout his life. Now, Longfellow is one of these figures who is not seen today as among the most major poets of the 19th century in America. Usually, if you take a 19th century American literature survey, there are two names that stand out preeminent in 19th century American poets. This is Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Usually Edgar Allan Poe will be thrown in there. And sure, if you get to kind of second tier poets, Longfellow's name will be listed. But if you say we're in London in the mid 1850s, and someone on the street said, "Hey, American poetry, what's the best stuff that's going on there?" Likely you would have said, well, the poems of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, of course. You wouldn't have known about Walt Whitman, probably. His first poetry was published in 1855. You wouldn't have known at all about Emily Dickinson during her lifetime. Her poems were published after her death in the 1890s. And so to experience 19th century American poetry as it happened would have been to have Longfellow as the central figure. Now, there were others, people like James Russell Lowell, people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, people like Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So it's not like Longfellow was the only well-known American poet of his day, but he was preeminent among them. And so I want to give a brief overview of his life and how he got to be the most famous American poet in the world, and then look a little bit about how he interacted with the classics and really made possible and promoted the study of the classics in America as it exists today. So Longfellow was born in 1807 in Portland. Now, Portland, at the time Longfellow was born there, was part of Massachusetts, but Portland and the surrounding areas was sort of cordoned off as a new state, Maine, later in American history. And so these days, we talk about Longfellow being born in Portland, Maine. He would have thought of it as Portland, Massachusetts. You can think of it however you want, but he's born in Portland, Maine, so very, very northerly. And he grew up as a young boy being able to see the ocean from his bedroom window. And in fact, he records that as a boy during the War of 1812, he would have been 5 years old, he could watch ship battles off the coast from his house. He could hear the booming of the ships. So he's kind of living American history as a boy, from a safe distance, but that made a deep impression on him. And from his youth, he very much cared about the history of America. His maternal grandfather had been a war hero, and so he very much imbibed this, like, I'm a son of America living in an early generation of Americans. It was only within a generation or two that the founding took place. And so he was very aware of his place in history. And also, as he got older and went to college at Bowdoin College in Maine, he ended up with this sense that American literary history was wide open for the taking. And when he graduated from Bowdoin College, he told his father, I want to be a writer. And his father said, get real. Writers don't make any money. You should be a lawyer. And so he studied for law a little bit. But really, what he wanted to do is teach and write the kind of literature that he read when he was in college. One of his classmates at Bowdoin College was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who would go on to be, one of the great fiction writers of the American 20th century or 19th century. And so Longfellow, in his kind of savvy desperation to be a writer, made a deal with his old college because he had heard that Harvard had started a modern languages department. So modern languages was a very newfangled department in the American university at this point. Instead of studying Greek and Latin, which everyone knows you should study, they were studying like French and Italian and Spanish. And this was kind of seen as new. Modern languages, why would we study those? But Longfellow loved the modern languages. And so he basically made a deal with Bowdoin College to create a professorship of modern languages and then to hire him to teach it. And they, knowing that Longfellow was maybe a little, inexperienced, said, look, we'll send you to Europe to study the European languages. And if you're sufficiently well-versed in them by the time you come back, then we'll give you a professorship. And so Longfellow was all for it. So Longfellow spends basically the late 1820s in Europe from 1826 to 1829. He gallivants around Spain and Italy and France and Germany, and he really fell in love with Europe and European culture and European literatures. And so when he got back to Bowdoin in 1829, he realized, oh, I have to teach modern languages, but there are no textbooks for teaching, say, French to American students. They don't exist in America. And so Longfellow basically wrote and printed the first modern languages textbooks in American history. And through that, got a taste for writing poetry. He loved doing translations of the sonnets of the Spanish Golden Age, of Italian literature. Some of his early translations are from Dante's Purgatorio. And he began to see, hey, maybe there's a career for me as a professor poet. And in 1839, he would end up publishing his first book of poetry, but some things happened before that. So from the 20s through the mid 30s, he taught at Bowdoin, but he felt like he was kind of up too far to the north of everything that was happening. He really thought Harvard is the place to be. And so he managed to talk to Harvard, and Harvard's first professor of modern languages was retiring. And he basically put himself up for the job. And Harvard said, kind of like Bowdoin had, you need to go study in Europe a little bit more because they wanted him to teach Scandinavian languages. So around 1835, Longfellow had recently fallen in love and gotten married to a woman named Mary. And so basically Harvard paid for Longfellow and his new wife to go study in Europe. They did, but tragedy befell in Europe. His wife became pregnant. There were complications with the pregnancy, and both mother and baby died. And so Longfellow was sitting there, on the cusp of this great career as a professor at Harvard, just devastated. And he wandered around Germany for many, many months. He ran into the American poet William Cullen Bryant, who kind of helped encourage him to carry on. And Longfellow moved back to America in his personal life in shambles, but his professional life on the upswing. And this created for Longfellow the ability to write about the personal tragedies and struggles of the American. And the first poem he writes about this that is published in 1839 that becomes really popular is called A Psalm of Life. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not as they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Later in the poem, he concludes, not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined ender way, but to act that each tomorrow find us further than today. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. And this idea of laboring and waiting became this kind of hallmark of this almost kind of stoic sensibility in Longfellow, Some have said that Longfellow's idea of like laboring and waiting, even in the midst of sorrow, reminds them a little bit of kind of the Benjamin Franklin aphorisms of the previous century that, Americans need to, work hard and, have a stiff upper lip and, just, make it in this new world. And are you going to have luxury and happiness? Of course not. You're American. It's going to be hard, but you're going to do it. And so Longfellow really touched a chord with the American reading public with Psalm of Life and other poems. And he collected this poem into a collection called Voices of the Night, which was published in 1839 and really rocketed him to stardom. He kind of thought, I think, in the 1830s that he would be popular primarily for his scholarly work. But it turned out his poetry about his real personal grief ended up being the poetry that really connected with people. And so from the late 1830s through the 1850s, he taught at Harvard and had a career as a Harvard professor. But more and more, he became popular and started making money from his poetry. And by the 1850s, he was able to retire from teaching and just write full time. Longfellow was one of the first people to think about owning the rights to his own poems. So whenever anyone wanted to print them, they had to pay him to get the book plates to print his poems. And his poetry was printed far and wide in New England, certainly where he lived, but also in London, in Europe. He ended up becoming friends with poets in Germany, in Italy, and elsewhere. And so he became a kind of a celebrity of poetry. Now, there's a bell ringing in the background that you might be able to hear. One of Longfellow's most important poems later in his career was called The Clock Upon the Stairs, and it was about the ringing of the clock. And so Longfellow really had this focus not just on personal sorrow and tragedy and having to move on from it, but also this idea that the American home is of great value, whether it's The Clock on the Stairs, or there's another poem called The Children's Hour, which is about being a father and enjoying being interrupted in your work by your laughing children. And so he became this poet of the hearth and home, and it even gained him a nickname. People started calling him a fireside poet, and other poets, especially James Russell Lowell and John G. Whittier, who he was friends with and wrote a similar poetry to, they became known as the fireside poets. This idea that the hearth and the home is central to not just the life of Americans, but the life of a man. He really cared about masculinity and saw masculinity as bound up in being sort of the guardian and the patriarch and sort of the wise, tender, father. He wasn't a macho man. He wasn't out there, wrangling cattle or, in battle. He was a very peace-loving man. And so Longfellow really established himself as this voice of America. Now, I want to highlight a couple more things about his life and then look at the classics. I mentioned he wrote a poem about being a father and the hearth and the home, but when I last talked about his love life, he was single, having experienced, great tragedy. Well, it turned out he kind of had this on again, off again relationship with a woman that he met in Germany when he was grieving over the death of his first wife. It turned out she was with her family on vacation in Germany, but she lived just down the road from him in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. And so when he got back from Germany, started his career at Harvard, he thought, maybe I'll play court to her. He was friends with her family, but she didn't want anything to do with him. And so he was sad about that too. And he ended up going on another journey to Europe because he was in poor health in 1842. And he hung out with Charles Dickens at that point. And Dickens kind of gave him this real perspective on American slavery. And he came back from Europe in 1842, basically like, I am an abolition man. We are going to fight for the freedom of the slaves. He wrote poems about abolition that got him in big trouble in the South. Southern publishers said, we won't publish your work because we don't publish the word slavery. And he said, great, I don't care. We'll publish it in the North. People will find my poetry anyway. Somewhere along the way, within the year after he gets back from Europe and kind of has moved on with his life, this girl who had been courting basically says, Longfellow is pretty cool. Maybe we should invite him over. And so I think through her sister, he gets invited to a party. By the end of the evening, they're engaged. And so they get married and have a very happy life for the next 20 or so years from the early 1840s to the 1860s. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the 1860s and Longfellow, because in the 1860s, Longfellow faces his next great tragedy, which is his second wife actually dies in 1861. She dies in a fire, which also burned Longfellow. One of the reasons that when you see pictures of Longfellow, he has a long beard, it's because he was scarred from the fire. And so Longfellow again falls into great sadness. It's 1861 too, so the Civil War is taking place. Longfellow had a very difficult 1860s. And in the 1860s, after his wife dies, his son goes off to fight for the Union. Thankfully, he survives the war. Longfellow decides, I don't know that I can write poetry anymore. I'm going to turn back to translation. And one of the things he had translated early on in his life, like I mentioned, is passages from Dante's Purgatorio. And what Longfellow discerned was there is no American translation of the Divine Comedy. And so he got some of his friends together, especially Charles Eliot Norton, James Russell Lowell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he basically said, hey guys, what if we start like this Dante club where we each try and translate a work of Dante's? And Longfellow, of course, for himself, he's like, I'll be translating the Divine Comedy. And so he did. He met with these guys every week or two, and they would go over his translations of the Divine Comedy. And from basically 1862, 63 to 1867, Longfellow translates the first American translation of the whole comedy. And that club that they started, which was called the Dante Club informally, Charles Eliot Norton ended up keeping that club going after Longfellow was done translating, and it became the Dante Society of America. And to this day, you can join the Dante Society of America. They have a journal that they put out every year. If you pay the Dante Society of America $1,321, 1321 is the year of Dante's death, you can become a member for life. I haven't done that, but I think that's cool. And so Longfellow, he's writing poetry, he's facing these personal setbacks, he has this tragedy in his life, but when he has tragedy, he turns to poetry and he turns to the classics. And in so doing, he kind of invents this American interest, especially in medieval literature, especially the literature of Dante. And so if you love Dante and you're an American, Longfellow really created the first fervor over Dante and interest in Dante. And there was a lot of pushback. This is something that Matthew Pearl has written about. People in the 1860s in America saw Dante as, he's Roman Catholic, so a little suspect. In America we're Protestants, right? Especially at Harvard, they weren't just Protestants, they were, progressive Unitarians mostly, or Transcendentalists. And also Dante's medieval, that's really old fashioned. We don't want that. That's European medievalism. That's the opposite of American, progress and independence and democracy. And so there was a lot of pushback culturally to this interest in Dante, but nevertheless, through this translation, Longfellow really showed the importance of Dante. I want to read to you from the opening of his translation of Inferno Canto 1. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say, what was this forest savage, rough, and stern? Which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter it is, death is little more. But of the good to treat, which there I found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. So if you're familiar with Dante, this will come as no shock that it's about this, but his diction is interesting. Instead of a dark wood, or a dark forest, he says a forest dark. And he was actually criticized a little bit for this inversion of language. I think someone said, it might have been James Russell Lowell, that he didn't really fully translate Dante into English. He just switched all the Italian words for English words, but they're still in Italian word order. So you get forest dark. Selva oscura is, I think, the Italian there. And he thought it was important that you have selva, forest, and then oscura, dark, and keep that same word order. This means that when you read Dante's translation of the Divine Comedy, you're really seeing a lot of Dante's word choices and word orders in a way that you're not in a more modern translation. Now, I'm a big fan of Dorothy Sayers, Anthony Esolen. They're great translators, but it's really with Longfellow that you get to see a very precise critical approach to translating Dante in the language of 19th century America. So I spent a lot of time on Longfellow and Dante as the classics, but Longfellow also loved other classics. One of the things that Dante really loved throughout his life was German literature. And I want to read to you from a letter that Longfellow sent to his father while he was a professor at Harvard. And he basically says, "Hey, Dad, I'm giving all these lectures on modern literature. Here's the list of lectures I'm giving this semester." So he says, History of the French Language, Lecture 1. History of the Northern or Gothic Languages, Lecture 2. Anglo-Saxon Literature, Lecture 3. Swedish Literature, now that's in two separate lectures. Takes two lectures to get through Swedish literature. Sketch of German Literature. Life and Writings of Goethe, and Life and Writings of John Paul Richter. Now, Goethe is in there. He's an Author Bank author, so it's good to hear that. Also, in his Anglo-Saxon literature, he would have talked about Beowulf, another good Author Bank text. And Longfellow actually translated part of Beowulf into English. And I wanted to read to you just a little bit from his translation of Beowulf. It's going to take me a minute to get to it. Sorry.
No worries, you're good.
You can cut this part out if you need to. Right, so this is from Beowulf's expedition to Heorot, from the Anglo-Saxon. Thus then much careworn the son of Healfdene sorrowed evermore, nor might the prudent hero his woes avert. The war was too hard, too loath and longsome, that on the people came dire wrath and grim of night woes the worst. This from home heard Higelac's thane, good among the Goths, Grendel's deeds. He was of mankind in might the strongest. At that day of his life, noble and stalwart, he bade him a sea ship, a goodly one prepare. Quoth he the war king, over the Swan's road, seek he would the mighty monarch, since he wanted men. Very different in tone from the translation of Dante. And you can see with the Dante, that 11-line Italian, or 11-syllable Italian line, Longfellow is approximating very well in that iambic pentameter line. Usually iambic pentameter is 10 syllables, but he's approximating it with a regular iambic rhythm midway upon the journey of our life. How different that rhythm and texture of language is to thus then much careworn, the son of Healfdene, sorrowed evermore. He bade him a sea ship, a goodly one prepare. He bade him a sea ship has that good two stress syllables in the line. Also, sea ship is a nice kenning word, meaning, a boat that they're traveling on. We also have the Swan's Road, which would be the water. So Longfellow, in his ear for the Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse, is showing, depending on the classic that you're translating, you're going to use a very different approach. This is something I think modern translators can learn from. This isn't a lecture giving advice to modern translators, but sometimes we translate too often all things, whether Beowulf or Dante or Homer, into kind of a modern free verse, because we're like, we want it to be accessible. But then we lose that thing that Longfellow cared so much about, which is the distinctive formal and aesthetic qualities of the modern languages. Italian's very different than Anglo-Saxon, and so you should translate them differently, he thought. I want to go back to that list of lectures for a minute, because he talked about the life of Goethe. He loved Goethe. He translated short poems by Goethe. He didn't translate Faust. It would have been interesting to see what Longfellow's Faust looked like. But he also mentions the life and writings of Jean-Paul Richter. Jean-Paul Richter is not someone people study. He's not in the Author Bank. He's one of these kind of lost authors that if you look at sort of the writings of the 1830s and 40s about German literature, everyone's on about Jean-Paul Richter, and now we don't really pay attention to him. Longfellow, in this way, in putting Goethe and Richter and Beowulf and Dante at the same level, was reflecting the classical inheritance of his time. And I think this is something that really has to do with Longfellow himself. Sometimes authors show their prowess and show their greatness, and then for one reason or another fade in a later age. That happened to Richter, and it's happened to Longfellow. And yet the fact that I'm giving a lecture on him, the fact that you can go on Amazon and find, 3 or 4 great biographies of Longfellow published in the last 10, 20 years, means you also have upswings of authors. Sometimes authors come back into our consciousness. I want to end talking just a little bit about Longfellow as a writer of classics himself. And I want to point you to 2 particular texts that I think will go on and continue to be classics long after, many other writings have faded away. And this is Evangeline and the Song of Hiawatha. So I want to read to you from the opening of Evangeline as we close. Evangeline, tell me if you've heard this story before, is about a group of people who live in a city and think it's going to last forever, and then an invading army comes in and destroys the city, and they have to leave as exiles to find a new home. Does that sound like any stories you've heard? Maybe the Aeneid, maybe, I don't know, it sounds a little bit like Exodus to me, this sort of journeying to a promised land. But in Evangeline, it's about a group of French Catholics who live in Nova Scotia, who are exiled by the evil British armies. It's a good American book. You also always have to have some evil British. They kick these nice, French Catholics out of Nova Scotia, and they find a new land in America. And so I want to read to you from the opening lines of Evangeline. These are some of the most beautiful lines in all of American literature. We have the clock going off to remind you of the importance of musicality in literature as well. It's a cuckoo clock, and we love it here at St. Constantine College, and it goes off every half an hour, and so it's great. So this is Evangeline. I'm going to wait till the ringing is done. Are we going to get 10 rings? I think we're going to get 10 rings.
Does it go off every half hour or so?
It does, but it's currently off. Oh, I see. It's half an hour off, so it thinks it's 11. Okay, so these are the opening lines of Evangeline. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight, stand like druids of eld with voices sad and prophetic, stand like harpers hoar with beards that rest on their bosoms. Loud from its rocky caverns, the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wail of the forest. This is a beautiful picture of the forests of Nova Scotia. And one of the things that's so important about this poem is it was written in the mid-1840s, published in 1847, and it was really Longfellow's first major contribution to narrative poetry. And what he did was controversial. He chose dactylic hexameter as his meter. So this is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. You have da 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 da. This is the meter of Virgil in the Aeneid. This is the meter of Homer in the Iliad and Odyssey. And many people, when Longfellow wrote this, said, why are you imitating the old classics? That's not what we do in America. Maybe you should write an iambic pentameter, or maybe even something looser than that. And he said, no, if you're translating Dante, you need iambic pentameter because Dante wrote an iambic pentameter, or the Italian approximation thereof. But if I'm going to tell a story about exiles and ship journeys and long lost loves and husbands searching for their wives across time and distance and wives searching for their husbands, like he does in Evangeline, he knew he needed the meter of Virgil. And so he manages for over 1,300 lines to tell a story in dactylic hexameter, showing, I believe, and I've written a book on this, so it was my first book on Longfellow, showing the continuity between the events and the struggles and the beauties of the stories of the New World and those oldest stories like Homer and Virgil, which we keep coming back to, which ground us as classics, and yet we can imitate and engage with and do our new versions of, paying homage to them, but understanding our American selves. So it's one of the reasons why I love Longfellow. It's one of the reasons why you should care about Longfellow. And I think that even though he's not part of the author bank, he loves the author bank and is always pointing us back. So thank you.
That was wonderful, Dr. Bartel. A few comments from me that I was thinking about while you were speaking, and then I'll give you a chance to tell us more about St. Constantine College. How can students and families connect with you? How can they get on campus and hear the cuckoo clock? But before that, two things. First, just the importance of Longfellow as a historical figure, his poetry about slavery, his role in higher education, his contributions to narrative poetry. Um, yeah, just it was amazing to hear the background in his life story that informed the poetry and the translation. Dante, the works that he did, really wonderful. And second, my another thought that I had was you talked about how he thought that he would be known for his scholarly works, where
Yeah.
what resonated with people was the personal tragedy and grief and different things that he went through in life, and probably how that made them reckon with the tragedy and grief and maybe process those things in their own lives too, in our own lives. And don't the great books and great texts and the great conversation, doesn't it demand that of us too? So I feel like
Yeah.
that's another connection to
Yeah.
classical texts and the great conversation as well. The response that those works draw out of us.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I think it's James Baldwin who said, they told me not to read European literature, but I read Dostoevsky and I saw Dostoevsky experience what I experience. How dare they tell me not to read Dostoevsky? Even though we're separated by culture and race and time, he and I are both human and we resonate across time. And I think this is something Longfellow like really deeply believed. And I think it runs very much in a line of what Dana Gioia calls kind of the Christian humanist tradition. This idea that like if you're human, if you're made in the image of God in the Christian understanding, you're going to resonate with all other humans, even if they lived at very different times, places, cultures than you. And literature is our bridge across time. And I think, it's good to be able to make distinctions between, in this era, they wrote this kind of literature and focus on these themes. And in this era, they, did something different. And yet you're always seeing resonances and connections because we're all human. I once told a group of kind of bored teenagers in a high school class that I subbed for, I said, look, it could be that the most important thing in every novel and every poem is just the author sort of peering from the pages and saying, help, I'm human. And so, some say it, some whisper it, some yell it. Dostoevsky yells it more than Longfellow does. But this shared humanity is important. But I also think for American readers, Longfellow has an imagination about America that is distinctively American and proud to be American, but also very informed by the classical past and doesn't see American identity and American problems, frankly, as very different than the problems and lessons and wisdom from, Europe or the Middle East or he was very interested in Islamic cultures as well and did some translations from Persian poetry. So he had a almost kind of a world spanning desire to gather in literature. This actually comes from the German scholarly uh, climate that he met in Germany when he first was there. There was this interest in what they called Weltliteratur or world literature, saying, just European literature isn't enough. We need voices from all over the world that are informing us, and their classics are our inheritance.
Awesome, Dr. Bartel. Thanks so much for those additional comments. Two last things. Tell us the name of your book on Longfellow,
Yeah.
and then tell us how students and families can connect with you and other great folks and faculty at St. Constantine.
Yeah, so I actually have two books on Longfellow. My first book is called Glimpses of Her Father's Glory: Deification and Divine Light in Longfellow's Evangeline. It was based on my PhD dissertation. So if it sounds long and complicated, it is. I mostly look at Longfellow's theological imagery and kind of the theology and theologians that he was reading that influenced how he writes about Evangeline and her journey and basically her sanctification process. It's a little bit more niche in the theology of Longfellow. My second book, which I would say if someone's interested in reading my books on Longfellow, the second one would be good to begin with. It's called The Heroines of Henry Longfellow: Domestic, Defiant, Divine. And it was in that book that I said, hey, I spent all this time in Evangeline, but really, like, Longfellow has all these great heroines, in Evangeline, in The Corpses of Miles Standish, in Hiawatha, in some of his plays that are lesser known. And so I basically do a survey of Longfellow's narrative writings from the beginning to the end of his career and look at his heroines. Like, who are these women? How are they distinguished? What does their heroism consist in? And there's some really interesting ways that I think Longfellow is running counter to, like, uh, Hawthorne and Poe in particular. They like their kind of sad heroines who are in love and kind of give up everything for love of a man. Longfellow kind of thinks romance is important, but he's more interested in women who kind of stand for truth and justice in societies that are opposed to them and become these beacons of kind of like fighting for the moral good in societies. And so that was really fun to explore, and I think that's a better place to start. Um, let's talk about St. Constantine College. So I love working here. We are a classical Orthodox college. We are a ministry of the Orthodox Christian Church, but like a lot of schools, we really care about inviting anyone who wants to come study the great books with us. We have one major. It's a great text of the Christian tradition. We do an interdisciplinary approach to great texts where we're reading philosophy, theology, literature, history, political thought, in an integrated chronological way. We have small group discussions as our core required classes. So, I'm not sitting here lecturing. I'm asking you, what did you think of, Aeneas's choice to leave Dido at the end of book 4 of the Aeneid, spoiler alert, and the students discuss it together. This is the old Socratic method. And we think it's important for students to be able to think for themselves in a community, right? If we are truth-seeking beings, truth-knowing beings, but if truth is difficult to find, then we need companions, we need friends, and we need mentors. And so we're set up to be a place of mentorship and friendship to seek the truth in the classics together. And so that's kind of the core of our study. We also have, though, for our writing program, what we call individual tutorials. And so you don't just write a paper, hand it to a professor, and get it graded back in a couple of weeks, like in a normal class. Every writing assignment you do for a great text program, you write and then bring and present one-on-one to a mentor on a weekly basis and get detailed feedback in person from your mentor and then revise it. And this is something you do every week of the semester for all 4 years. This is how Oxford does, especially humanities classes. And we thought, if Oxford has been doing it for 800 years, probably it's a tried and true method. And we found that it's a way to help every student where they are and also individualize their course of study and their research interests and their abilities and talents. When you're in a room with 30 other students in a writing class, you can only help each person so much. When it's just one person in a writing class, you can help them hone their voice, their research skills, their ability to read closely, their ability to both communicate on paper and out loud in such a more robust way. And so with those small group discussions on the great text and with our individual tutorials, we try and hit both the individual personalized needs and particular interests of each student, but also engage them in a community of scholarship where they are hopefully creating lifelong friends about the most important questions of the ages and the most beautiful texts that have ever been written. So if you want to know more about St. Constantine College, you can visit our website, stconstantinecollege.org. There's a way to request an info packet on the website. Also, if you want to come take a tour of the school, you can book a tour from our website. We are in Houston, Texas, tucked away among the oak trees in Southwest Houston. Those who are interested, those who are looking for a college education that's going to put the soul of the student first when it comes to a search for truth, an understanding of the enduring questions and ideas, not the passing fads, not the textbook that you're going to read and is going to be outdated next year, but of Dante, Virgil, Shakespeare. Our upper division classes, we have a whole semester just dedicated to the dialogues of Plato, a whole semester just dedicated to medieval literature, focusing on Beowulf and the Divine Comedy, a whole semester dedicated to the plays of Shakespeare. So we're studying the classics in wide breadth and in tremendous depth. And by the end of the program of study, each student writes a senior thesis on any great text and great author they want, and they produce a publishable kind of grad school level thesis paper on that. So we don't want to just say, hey, you're going to read some books and have some fun conversations. We also want to prepare you to go off and be an educator, to be a scholar, to be a leader in your community, whether that's, in your church, in your neighborhood, on the city council. We've had students go on to become lawyers, to become literary scholars. We really want to train you in the liberal arts, in the core ideas and classics, so you can go serve your country, your church, your community in the ways that are going to be best for you, having that grounding that's interdisciplinary.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Bartel, for your time, for the wonderful lecture. And if anyone is interested, please do visit St. Constantine, ask us any questions at CLT, info@cltexam.com. We'll get you connected to the right people. And thanks so much for joining us today.